first Margo Talk. My name is Margo Krager. I'm a shop owner and a textile historian. I grew up around textiles. Both of my grandmothers made garments. My mother made most of my clothes, and I grew up in Wheeling, West Virginia, and had a calico works in town from 1835 until 1957. My bachelor's degree is in medical technology from Michigan State, and that's what I did for 15 years. And then I tell people I changed needles and I opened a fabric store. This is my 41st year in the fabric business, and I'm now in Northfield, Minnesota. My historic interest in fabric is to do with dye stuffs and changes in dye stuffs and changes in printing technology. Today we're going to have a 10 to 15 minute textile history snapshot, and the topic is hand painted to digital. So I want to talk a little bit about fabrics for garments in Europe in the 16th century. People were wearing linen and wool, and the very wealthy had access to silk. So the East India Company in London got its charter to head off on a trading mission New Year's Eve of 1600 from the first Queen Elizabeth. They headed down to the East Indies, lead, tin, bullion, and good British wool. The merchants, the spice merchants there, were not particularly impressed. They already had established trading relations with the Portuguese, and they didn't particularly like what the British brought to trade. So the British listened and found out what the people there really wanted were the cottons from India. India clothed the world in cotton from 1400 to 1800. So the next sailing season, the British headed off again and stopped in India. Once again, lead, tin, bullion, and good British wool, and traded for cotton. They headed off then to the East Indies. They had a little better reception at this time and traded for spices. But they had a few leftover cottons, which they still had in the hull of their ship. They ended up at the docks in London, sold off the spices, and then pulled out the cottons and sold those on the docks. People were impressed. This fabric was colorful and color fast. It was washable and comfortable to wear. So this started the three-part trade between England, India, and the East Indies. Some of the things they brought were hand-painted chintzes. These could take up to 2 years to produce using indigo, which is the only natural dye with affinity for cotton, and madder dye baths. They also brought some domestic production that would have been sold in India, and they were simple woodblock prints and then yarn dyed fabrics, which would have been chambrays, woven stripes, and woven plaids. So the 17th century Indian craftspeople had several high-end customers with different taste, and they accommodated all three of these. The Mughal court, which was northern India that skirted along the southern edge of Afghanistan on through Kashmir, the Thai court, and the people in Java. And these craftspeople in India thought that they could make adjustments to their styling and colorations to suit the European taste. So the East India Company started sending down what they called musters, and they were to give an indication of what was popular in Great Britain. Some of them were crewel embroideries, others were printed 15th century herbals and paintings of flowers. And the Indian craftsmen quickly adapted using lighter backgrounds and much more to the British and the French tastes. The Dutch, however, who are now down there trading, had an affinity for things that were bolder and brighter. So the Indian craftspeople adapted to all of that and produced some wonderful chintzes. Okay, on wood blocks, they could be very simple. They were usually rather small, 5 to 6 inches, maybe 10 to 12 inches. It really depended on the size of the hand of the woodblock printer, how big they could handle those wood blocks. And often they added detail to the design by pounding in nail heads, and that was called picotage, with little dots to emphasize a flower or a stem or a leaf. And sometimes they took brass, strips of brass, turned them on their side and pounded them into the wood block. This gave more detail, more sharpness to a stem or a vine. And other areas, they would gouge out the wood block and insert wool felt, and this absorbed more dye stuff, so you could print a bigger area of that dye stuff. In 1750, an Irishman named Nixon made a change in the dye stuffs having to do with rheology. Rheology is the physics of flow, so the difference between your salad dressing and your toothpaste. So he needed a dye stuff that he could charge an etched out copper plate. Sometimes they were as big as 36 inches square. So the fabric would be on a work table facing up, and the copper plate would come down onto that fabric. So the dye stuff had to stay in those grooves until he brought it down onto the fabric and then release onto the fabric without running and creating a blob. So he sold his invention to a firm in London, and this style of printing quickly moved over to France. You might think of toiles de Jouy, which Oberkampf was printing as Jouy. Usually they were monochromatic and often very contemporary. In 1783, the first hot air balloon went up over Paris, and that next spring there was a toile featuring a hot air balloon. In 1827, a giraffe was gifted to the King of France from a ruler in Africa. He sent the giraffe across over to Marseille. The giraffe and its handler disembarked and walked to Paris, and that next season there were giraffes on toiles. In 1783, a Scotsman named Bell took that copper plate and turned it into a roller. And by 1810, he was starting to print more than 2 colors at once. For that 25 years there approximately, it was just 1 color prints with the roller. And by 1840, there were multiple color prints. And a copper roller mechanism could print more than 40 in a day, more than 40 hand blockers could do. Much of Europe and America shifted to silkscreen printing around 1910. And that is a lot of what is still used in the fabric industry today, especially in Japan and South Korea. The tricky part there is that you need to run per design, when you turn the machinery on, about 3,000 yards. And normally they do 3 colors. So you might do 1,000 of yellow of the design, 1,000 of blue, and then 1,000 of pink. But there's somebody that stands between me and the printing machine, and he or she is called a fabric stylist, and they're definitely left brain, right brain kind of people. So they're very artistic, but they understand the limitations of the printing process. And when I've done my reproduction lines, I've done 26 of them now, this person would tell me, now Margo, you can't bleach out, void out the silk screen to get the detail of the designs in your 19th century sample books. So there might have been 6 little tendrils along a stem, and they told me I could have 2, because otherwise it would weaken the silk screen and I just couldn't have it. So now the switch to digital, one of the advantages there is you can do a run of maybe 500 yards. But the advantage to me is the detail. I'm now able to get the detail in my sample books that had used copper rollers. Now that some printing has gone to digital, you can do a design just 500 yards and all the detail I could ever wish for from my 19th century samples. So the quilt top behind me, The bright Prussian blue long stem flowers are from my 1849 sample book, and they are dress goods. And my American Girl doll beside me, this is a pattern by Pemberley Threads, a lady in Great Britain that does historic doll costume patterns. And it's an 1840s fan front dress done in an ombre, which is typical of the 1840s, and the pattern is out of my 1849 sample book. This is a quilt for my rather bookish 18-year-old grandson. It's called Book Nerd, and I used a selection of turn of the 20th century Shaker grays, and I think it has sort of a modern and masculine look to it. So you can use reproduction fabrics in different ways and get a different feel for your project. If you have questions about historic printing and dyeing of cotton textiles, you can contact me.